that are visiting from the east, okay, and they come and they see King Herod. Whereas if you look at the other stories, they don't talk about the kings. All right, so Matthew as a gospel is concerned about kingship, kingdom. So he uses the expression kingdom of heaven a number of times. In the Christmas story, he talks about kingly matters, kingly concerns. Matthew is the one who includes the parables about the kingdom of heaven is like, okay? The Sermon on the Mount is recorded at length there, and in that sermon, Jesus is giving his sort of inaugural address, and he's talking about how to be a citizen of the kingdom. Okay? It's pretty prominent. But if you go to Matthew chapter 1, and I'm going to be reading a few segments here, so if you have a Bible nearby, I have my Bible app, feel free to follow along. I'll try to keep you oriented to where I am. But Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, starts out very emphatically with this theme as it begins to tell the story of the Nativity. This is chapter 1, verse 1 of Matthew. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, that right there is a kingly concern. This promised king was the Messiah. The son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay? Connects him with the promise to Abraham for that nation to bless all nations, and the most successful or most prominent king of Israel, David. He's a son of David. So right from the beginning, as Matthew tells the story of the Nativity, he is naturally concerned with this kingdom, with this kingship component, because that is his most prominent theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew, as I see it. One of the most prominent. I think it is the most prominent one, but you could debate me afterwards if you'd like. Whatever the case, it's there. He is the son of David, that kingly line, and he is about this kingdom of heaven. So that's how the story begins. As we read down through the story, we see the genealogy given there at length, and as with most genealogies, we're going to just skip right through those. They mean less to us, perhaps, than they meant to the original reader. And you go to verse 18 of chapter 1 here in Matthew. And it says, "This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. But before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit." Now, what's missing here in Matthew's account that you might be expecting to see if you haven't read these accounts comparatively recently is the annunciation, the announcement to Mary, the angel visiting Mary and telling her that she's the highly favored one and all that. That doesn't happen here. That's in a different gospel. So Matthew's not even concerned about telling Mary's story at length. Instead, in verse 19, he talks about Joseph. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And it cites some prophecies of the Old Testament, refers to Jesus as Emmanuel, God with us. And in verse 24, it's still talking about Joseph. Mary is almost a prop in the story. There are moments where she figures, there's a kind of an indication that she figures as an important figure, as an important person. But Matthew is really just concerned about this patriarchal line coming from King David down to this Messiah, the anointed one from that kingly line of David, and he wants to demonstrate that. So again, Mary is almost an afterthought. She's there, but she's not really of great concern. Then if you move over to chapter 2, you have, again, the wise men and Herod. Chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. It doesn't even tell us how he was born. There's no mention of shepherds. It doesn't give us any details about the birth or the location. It just says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Well, they came to Jerusalem because it's the center of power. He's concerned about things of kingship. And asked, when is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Verse 3 of chapter 2. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So all Jerusalem as in the center of power, those in the cabinets, they're all concerned about this king that was born, right? And we could continue down through the story. I think we basically know the story of what happens next, the interaction between the wise men and the experts in the law. They're trying to find out where this baby should be born. The wise men are supposed to report back to David, or to Herod, that is, Herod, where they find him, because Herod wants to worship him. Right? We know this story, and they end up sneaking out of town instead because an angel warns them. So as Matthew tells the story of the Nativity, the story of the Incarnation, he does use the expression Emmanuel, God with us. Okay, so that's kind of an encapsulation of this of the Incarnation, I suppose. But his primary concern seems to be matters of state. We have, again, King Herod. We have the Jerusalem people who are troubled, the people in power. We have these dignitaries visiting from the east. It's a thing of kingship. And that theme continues throughout the gospel, as I think I jumped ahead and already mentioned. Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, and it's talking about how to be a citizen of the kingdom. He gives some parables about the kingdom, starting often with the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. Okay. So as we think about Matthew's telling of the story, again, there are some things that are missing. There are no angels saying peace on earth. There's no group of shepherds. There's no record of the interaction between Mary and the angel. We don't have the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah. We don't have the dedication at the temple. It's all just King Herod, the wise men, and Joseph, really, in terms of points of emphasis. Oh, and the genealogy that places him in the line of David. Now, this is all interesting, and I'm saying it in terms of the contrast with the other Gospels, but Matthew's Gospel is good. It has some value, and I'm not trying to dismiss it as the lesser account, but its concerns are about matters of state, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus came to establish this kingdom of heaven. So let's begin to reflect and ask ourselves, what are the current issues that this might speak to? Okay. And I'm going to put a few ideas out there. Hopefully they'll be catalysts for your own thought, and we can, pick up some of your thoughts in the discussion afterwards. But we do in the United States, and I'm less familiar with the political dynamics in other places, but I sense that there's some of this there too, in other places too. But in the United States, we have this kind of merging of Christianity and the state. We think of we collectively, not me, but we collectively as a populace tend often to think of the United States as kind of this chosen nation, something like Israel. And there's this idea of establishing a kingdom on earth. But the story as it's told, the Christmas story as it's told in Matthew, is all about this kingdom of heaven. But Matthew is shifting our focus away from the kingdom of the earth to the kingdom of heaven. And so the Incarnation is about broadening the vision of what that kingdom is. How we can be citizens of that kingdom, even though there's not an established power structure. It's really about the way we live our lives. And so I think that Matthew is nudging us more that direction, disentangling our faith and our connection with God from our political structures, our nationhood, our earthly kingdoms. All right. So that's a suggestion of where we might go with Matthew's view of the Incarnation. We also then could go to Mark. Mark is a very different telling of the story. Mark doesn't tell the story of the incarnation. The closest thing that we get to a nativity story from Mark is point number 5 right there, that he uses the expression Son of Man a whole bunch. Son of Man. Now, that's an expression from the Old Testament. It was used in Ezekiel, where God was talking to Ezekiel and he would say, Son of Man, addressing Ezekiel as this, and it meant something like mortal, son of Adam, son of the dirt, earthling was the idea. And so Mark picks this up and says, okay, this is Jesus, he was an earthling. And Mark skates right past all of the backstory. Now, we can speculate as to why he does this, and I will. Perhaps you have some other speculation. He has no backstory. He doesn't tell about the nativity. He doesn't tell about the genealogies. He doesn't give us any context for kind of understanding where Jesus fits into the larger story. He just jumps into the center of the action. And he uses the word "and" excessively. So the Gospel of Mark could be described as one giant run-on sentence. Okay, so he's focused on the action, the observable, the things that the play-by-play, the eyewitness account of what they saw this Son of Man do. Okay, he also uses the word immediately about 40 times, I think it is, and that's about half the total times that it's used in the New Testament. So there's this focus on the action, on the play-by-play. And because of that focus on the action of what they actually saw, he skates right past the incarnation. There's nothing there in terms of a story. But I actually think that maybe Mark, I actually think that maybe Mark saw the play-by-play, the activity of this Son of Man, also termed Son of God, amidst the human family as the really crucial part of the incarnation. He was a person of action. He was here to do good among the people, to be restorative among the people. Okay. So I'd be interested to know what alternate theories you might have about why Mark doesn't tell the nativity story. But I really think, I'm suggesting to you that it has to do with his focus on what he saw was most important, the observable, the eyewitness account of this God-man doing good among the people and what that might mean. Okay. So for him, the incarnation, I think, is about what's happening now. So as we think about our own reflection on the meaning of the incarnation to us now, there may be something in Mark's approach for us. He had his approach for his time, but that general outlook of what really matters with the incarnation is what we see right now happening in human lives. There might be something there. Maybe we don't have to debate. This is the cop-out, or this is affirming Lauren in his mention of the cop-out before we started. Maybe we don't have to debate exactly how the incarnation happened. Maybe it really is about the change that happens in individual lives because Jesus is present. Okay. All right, so there's Mark. Not a lot to say. I wish I had more to say about Mark. Maybe one of you here will have something to say after I'm done monologuing. Then we go to Luke. And Luke has the most extended account of the Christmas story. So we definitely want to go to the Bible and read parts of this. There's too much to read, but I'll go to Luke chapter 1 to start with, if you're following along. Luke chapter 1, I'm getting there. And Luke famously begins his account by saying this is a research project. Verse 1 of Luke 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Okay. And then fairly quickly, he says a few more things, verses 3 and 4, but fairly quickly he goes to the incarnation. For Luke, the Incarnation is the starting point, it seems. But he tells, again, the extended story. And here in Luke chapter 1, verse 5, instead of telling the story of Jesus himself, he starts with John the Baptist. I know I said that he starts immediately with the Incarnation story, and I see this, he sees this as part of the Incarnation. In the time of King Herod of Judea, there's a mention of the king at least, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Okay, and we probably know this story. Zechariah goes in to serve at the temple. An angel shows up and he says that you're going to have a child. Your prayer has been answered. And which prayer, we don't know. This might have been a prayer that he and Elizabeth had prayed many years before for a child. They don't have a child, and that's a big deal. In our time, if you don't have a child, that might be fine. Maybe you chose not to have a child. Maybe there were some fertility issues, and you've worked through the emotions of that, but you can have reasonably good standing in society without children. But in their time, that wasn't the case. Having children meant having a legacy, which meant having meaning and purpose in the world. And if you didn't have that legacy, then your value was significantly minimized. So Luke begins his story of the Incarnation with somebody that doesn't matter, Zechariah. He's a failure. He hasn't had children. He can't carry on the family line. And at a time where lineage mattered a great deal, he can't contribute. He's on the margins. And similarly, Elizabeth, at a time when the value of a woman, unfortunately, was often in producing children, she hadn't produced any children. She was on the margin as well. And so pretty early on in the Gospel of Luke, we see that Luke is concerned about the inclusion of those who have been excluded. He's interested in re-enfranchising those who have been on the margins of Israel. Okay, and so he starts with, again, Zechariah and Elizabeth on the margins. Matthew doesn't mention them. Mark doesn't mention them. John won't mention them. But Luke wants to, and it's for that purpose of focusing on those on the margins. So we continue down through the story. John the Baptist, of course, is miraculously conceived. He is born and he serves an important role as forerunner of Jesus. But if you jump over to chapter 2, we get to the actual birth of Jesus himself. And I'll read chapter 2, starting in verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David. Does mention David. The kingship dimension is running in the background for Luke as well, but it's not the centerpiece. Because he belonged to the house and line of David, he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Okay, so this is where we find those details of the setting and those other, the details that often show up in that pageant. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks by night. I should mention, before we get into the shepherd story, that I skipped past the angel's interaction with Mary. Luke features Mary as another one of those kind of marginalized people, the people that are kind of the prop for the story. The woman, yes, she does all the work, but in their telling of the stories, oftentimes the woman was kind of the prop. She was a minor character. It was really about that lineage of Joseph, right? But Luke includes her. So he includes Zechariah, Elizabeth, he includes Mary, and now he's going to include some shepherds. And the shepherds, there's debate as to how the shepherds were viewed in society at the time, but they were certainly not the top of the social structure. Shepherds were often kids, so they were not at the top of the social structure. They were often women. And if you had a good flock of sheep and you were rich enough to pay somebody else to sleep out on the ground and take care of your sheep, you probably would. So these are not the people who are at the highest level in that pecking order, whatever the case. And Luke wants us to know that God announced the birth of his son to these people. So now we have Zechariah and Elizabeth, we have the shepherds, we have Mary featured highly, okay? So he's focusing on those who have been marginalized and giving them value in the Jesus story. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby. This is verse 8 again, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people." Now, some side notes here. It's interesting that when it says the glory of the Lord, it's probably referring to that same glory of the Lord that confronted Moses at the burning bush, or the glory of the Lord that was made its presence known in the temple. This is God himself is showing up in some way, and there's an angel there as well. And he says, "We bring you good news of great joy for all the people." So don't be afraid. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Messiah the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in clothes and lying in a manger. So there's this focus on the humble aspects of his birth as well. It says there will be joy, great joy for all the people of Israel. And the language there in the Greek suggests it's probably talking about the nation of Israel, but it's very inclusive, all the people, all right? Also, another side note is that this was probably not an angel choir up in the sky. It doesn't say they're in the sky, and it calls them an army, actually. So it's more like, in contrast to the Roman peace, this is the real peace, and God is bringing peace through another means. Verse 13. Suddenly a great company of the heavenly hosts, they're from heaven, but it doesn't say they're in heaven, in the heavens at the moment, appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, not singing, saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." When the angel had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." And the shepherds go and they see, and then they begin to tell everybody else. So the common folks are getting the word about this king. Now, this is again in contrast to the way that Matthew told this story, where it's about kingship and matters of state. And now Luke is like, no, it's about the common people. And we could add some other marginalized people to that list. There's Simeon at the temple when they take him to be dedicated, and Anna, both people who seem to be shuffled off to the side. But Luke wants us to know that they matter in the incarnation. So as we look at Luke's story, again, it's very much in contrast to Matthew's story. Matthew's story is about matters of state. Luke is concerned about the marginalized and including those who have been excluded. Okay. So again, reflecting on what would Luke's gospel and his account, his telling of the incarnation, speak to us in our time and place, we might immediately start to go to social issues. That this Jesus who came and whom we celebrate at Christmas time, this incarnation, was about including those who have been excluded. Luke's telling of the story is very much about that. I think that could, at least for me, that stirs up quite a bit. Like if this was what the incarnation was about, including those who were excluded from Luke's perspective, how am I living this faith of this Jesus who was born in Bethlehem, right? How are we living that out now? All right, so that's Luke. And I'm trying to get to the end of my monologue so we can dialogue, because I don't want to put anyone to sleep. But I hope that you're at least being reminded of the differences in the tellings of these stories. Okay. Now, John is very interesting. John doesn't actually tell the Christmas story either. He's kind of like Mark. But I would argue that John actually does in a very different way. He starts out with the creation theme, okay? And he's framing his whole gospel as an act of recreation. That the Jesus story is about this God who created coming back into the broken creation and recreating it. And this is the argument he makes. He starts out in chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, right? It's like the most famous line from the most famous document in ancient Israel, in the beginning. Oh, okay, this is the creation story. And then he shifts it. He says, no, actually it is, but I'm telling it differently now. It's kind of like if you started your sermon with every who down in Whoville, like Christmas a lot. We know exactly what document you're referring to, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's making a claim of divinity with reference to Jesus. So this is the claim he makes. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. Still continuing that creation imagery, because the first act of creation was, let there be light. He says, this God created all things. He was with God in the beginning. He was God. Through him all things were made, and he was the light at the beginning. Verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. If you skip down to verse 14, here is the Christmas story in miniature. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. There's a lot packed into verse 14. It's the basic claim that this God who created became flesh, human flesh, and lived among us, and we saw his glory. And what his glory looked like was grace and truth. I love that. I would love to just cogitate on that for a good while. But right now, I just want us to understand that as he begins the telling of the whole Jesus story, he begins with this idea of the incarnation, and he's making a claim that this is the creator come into creation. And then John proceeds to give us multiple signs, 7, 8, depending on how you count, of this claim, to prove this claim. This God came into the broken creation to recreate it. And then in chapter 2, we have the first, what John calls a sign or proof, an evidence of this claim. And that is, he's at the wedding feast. They run out of wine, perhaps because he brought all of his disciples to the feast and they didn't plan for that many people. Whatever the case, his mom comes to him. She seems to be connected with the family. She seems to feel responsible for it. She says, do something. And he does. He turns water to wine, right? And this, it says, is one of the first signs of this claim that he is the God come into human flesh. Okay. And then we see a series of additional signs. We see the sign of a man who has been paralyzed for 38 years, and Jesus creates good legs for him. It's the act of creation. Perhaps the most poignant creation moment is in chapter 9, where there's this man born blind, and his disciples are asking him the abstract theological question that was probably the prominent one in relationship to a man who was suffering. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's suffering this way? And Jesus says, nah, it's not about that. And he plays in the dust of the ground in order to create eyeballs in the man's sockets. Okay, it's a creation theme throughout. Even the conversations with the woman at the well in chapter 4, the Samaritan woman, and chapter 3 with Nicodemus use the creation imagery. In Nicodemus, in the conversation with Nicodemus, he says, you need to be born of water and the Spirit. Well, that's a pretty clear allusion in this context to the creation moment where the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. He's saying you need to go back and start over. But as far as the incarnation imagery, what John is trying to tell us is, again, that this creator has come into the broken creation to recreate. And we see little glimpses of that recreation in those miracles, presented as signs that he is indeed this creator that's come to recreate. All right. So in summary of these four gospel accounts, again, Matthew presents Jesus as this God who is king. And it's a different kind of kingdom. It's not an earthly kingdom. It's a heavenly kingdom. Mark presents the incarnation in terms of a God who acts. He works among us and does miracles and restores and all these good things. But it's that play-by-play. Really, it's about our experience with this Jesus. Forget the backstory. Forget the theological constructs to some extent. It's about the play-by-play, the action that made a difference in human lives. That's Mark. And in Luke, it is about the God who includes those who have been excluded or at least pushed to the margins. And with John, it is the God who recreates. So my broad question to you, and I know moderator will take this wherever you want to, but my broad question to you as a group is reflecting on these four different ways of seeing what the incarnation means. What does it mean to you or us now, given the context we're in and the issues that we're up against? How can the incarnation of Jesus speak more directly to those things? All right, moderator, tell us what to do next.
All right, of course, I hadn't posted a note yet, but now's the time to raise hands. And on everyone's screen, most people's screen, you'll find a spot that will give you a click that you can raise your hand. And we'll take them in order as much as possible. With your questions, comments, it's an informal forum. You're certainly encouraged to air your own view of things. And Horace was first up, and we'll go right to him. But I was going to ask, just from a professorial point of view, the Gospels, I know there's some question about who the authors were in some of the cases. And what's generally accepted as to which ones were actual disciples of Christ? Now, I know the incarnation story, none of them were around for that, and they're not using an eyewitness account. But I was kind of curious. It's a question that's come up in my Bible study from time to time. Are they, any of them, actual disciples through the ministry of Christ?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that this is debated. So as soon as I give an answer, it's wrong by someone's judgment. But I think it's generally accepted that John was one of Jesus' disciples, and also probably Levi Matthew. Mark was later. He probably got the general view that I get within my circles, right, is that Mark probably got his accounts of the Jesus story from Peter largely, and from others who were eyewitnesses, but he wasn't himself eyewitness. And so that may account in part for his overuse of the term immediately. Peter was a man of action, so this is how Peter told the story to him. And then Luke, tells us that he's doing a research project. So after the fact, he's talked to eyewitnesses and pulled all this together. So probably John and Matthew at most.
And I guess we also questioned whether they collaborated, knew each other, read each other's work before they wrote their own, or is there any way to can identify to what extent they try to be consistent?
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that Mark, Luke, and Matthew were familiar in some way with each other's work, at least in some sort of a line. Mark was probably written first, but part of that's based on the fact that it's sparse and play-by-play. So the idea is that, well, he was the first one to kind of write down the facts, and then others took and made them the telling of the story more theological and elaborate. But you have enough overlap in content in those three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that somebody knew somebody else's work for sure.
Very good. Well, Horace, you're first up. Welcome. Go right ahead with your comment or question.
First, thank you, James, for a refreshing look at what are familiar Gospels to us, it has been suggested that if we look at the Gospels in the order in which they were written, that we see a development in the concept of Jesus as God. So the Gospel of Mark, which was written first by most authors' opinions,
yes,
the Christians who read Mark would have known of Jesus as a man, nothing more than a man, a good man. And then at his baptism, we see the Spirit descending in the form of a dove, and then we hear the pronouncement, "This is now my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, hear ye him." In other words, Jesus became divine by adoption there, at his baptism. And then we come to the next gospel, which is Matthew. And then Matthew suggests through the nativity story that no, he was born as God, and his divinity was originated with his birth. And the same thing with Luke. And then we get to the Gospel of John, where John is saying, in effect, no, he wasn't God from baptism or from birth. He was God pre-existed. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, etc. So there's a progression in the understanding of Jesus' divinity. Is there any validity to that suggestion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think your question is more valuable to the conversation than my answer might be. I think that there could be some validity to that. And how we interpret, if there is a development in conceptualizing the divinity of Jesus, we could take that in a couple of different ways. At least we could say, well, this means that they are creating it, or this could mean that they are learning to perceive it for what it was. They're discovering, like, oh, that, to put the pieces together here, really, this means that he was, and so they're kind of having a collective realization over time. So I guess, we should have the conversation that you're framing. And then after that conversation, we should ask ourselves, okay, what does that mean if there is this development? Because yes, I see that progression. I think it's a fair academic observation. I think there is some validity to seeing it that way. But that's just an opinion for what that's worth. I think, again, your question and the way you framed it is probably more useful to the conversation than my answer.
Thank you, James. I wonder if I could follow up on just one more question, if I may, Mr. Moderator. When the Gospels were written, except perhaps for the Gospel of John, were they not all anonymous? Originally, the earliest manuscripts did not identify any of the authors of the Gospels. When we hear a Gospel according to Matthew or according to Mark, according to Luke, those are educated guesses from our early church fathers and scholars as to who might have written these Gospels. Is that true?
I mean, in a word, I think yes. It depends in large part on how much weight we give to early tradition. If we give a lot of weight to the early tradition, then, and we say, well, likely the people who were closest to the time they were written knew. They heard from grandpa and so on down. Then I think it's fairly clear. I think that the guessing may be a more recent thing. I think it was generally accepted earlier on who authored these. That wasn't highly debated. It's more of a recent academic concern as to whether we know or not. And the truth is, we probably can't know. What we can know as far as origin of these documents is that they were highly valued early on in Christianity by the Christian community. And I wonder if that's the better way to validate them. Maybe it doesn't matter who wrote them. If those who were closest to the situation said, nah, these are of value, they capture what Jesus meant to us as a community, let's preserve those and copy those and disseminate those. So I would validate it more by the community than by a specific name attached to them anyway. For whatever
Thank
that's
you,
worth.
James.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, very good. also occurs to me that I've heard it posited that the discrepancies between among the Gospels tend to reinforce the fact that they're authentic rather than copied from each other, and that it's the way people think. They have a different version of their own stories, or we know from the legal profession that the eyewitness accounts vary widely, not among each other, but from the actual facts in some cases. So is that currently accepted among biblical scholars, that that's the authenticity of them is supported by the discrepancies rather than attacked?
I think so. I don't think I'm the authority on that question, but I certainly encountered that frequently in the literature, current literature. So I think so.
Yeah. We'll need some more hands, folks. We do have a smaller group today, so we may not be going as long as normal. But I think the subject is interesting, the subject of the Incarnation and Christmas in general. If you have stories about how that's affected you and the people you love, it will also be of interest this time of year. I'm also curious about why the story has been embraced so much by the secular world as well, and why it has so much power. But Bjorn, go right ahead with your offering.
Thank you, and yeah, thanks for the presentation, Dr. Wibberding. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to throw my commercial in first, and then get to my question. So I just wanted to thank everyone. You've really I've seen your names in the giving that's already come in for the year-end fundraiser, and we have $7,000 left of matching funds. That is it from the 48,000. So you've really done amazingly. If anyone has not been able to do it yet, there's still time to do it. I'll post the link. But it helps us have these conversations. We referred earlier in the conversation to AT as family. This is a family that we're intent on growing, a place where we can have meaningful discussions, unfettered discussions, open discussions. And I think we all know that means a lot. I feel like Adventist today is trying to untether Adventism, is trying to help us be the best we can be, and you help us do that. So thank you very much for your support. So my question. I had a history teacher. I did my A-levels, which is kind of like the bridge between high school and university here in the UK. I had a history teacher who told us, he said, "I believe in Father Christmas, Santa Claus, and I fully believe in him, and I will not listen to a word of anyone that anyone that tries to dissuade me from that. I just will not listen. Like, I absolutely believe in Father Christmas." And so that's part of the DNA of obviously Western culture, certainly British culture. And it makes me wonder about how we talk about the Incarnation, how we talk about Christmas. And today in church, I was sitting next to a theologian friend, and he was being a total party pooper. I mean, he was like, the kids were up on stage, we're going to go sing their beautiful songs. And, it was, and he had this massive Christmas tree, and he was like, Bjorn, such and such a thing that we always thought happened didn't happen. He wasn't born in a manger. He wasn't this and that. He was like deconstructing the whole thing. I was like, shut up. I want to enjoy this. Like, this is anyway. So it was one of those times. So my question is basically, you walked us through the different emphases of the different Gospels. And we often, in Western culture, tie these stories to Christmas. And I grew up as a missionary kid, and that's not always done, because Christmas is not a big thing in some cultures. But my question is, especially with kids and youth in mind, how far would you go in using the angle of Christmas, and kind of using that as a hook to talk about the Incarnation? Like, what are the pitfalls there? Like, so what are the opportunities in fusing the two? Like, if Santa Claus and Father Christmas and all that, I'm in favor of it. And what do you think are the downfalls of mixing those two in the narrative? And because this is the time of year that we often talk about that story. So yeah, I just wanted to know, like, from that angle, how far should we go with the Christmas angle when we talk about the birth of Jesus?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the fact that we have 4 different tellings of the Jesus story gives us permission to have our own telling. So we can, if we want to bring Santa Claus in and some other traditions, I'm okay with tradition. I think I'm going to answer your question broadly, and it's just my opinion for whatever that's worth. But I think that story is theology.
Okay.
So to think about how that story is developing and what it's communicating is a worthy pursuit. And I think that could help us understand for ourselves, is it okay for me to bring all of these pieces together? Is it okay? You know, we have Santa Claus next to baby Jesus and the Christmas tree and, you know, and all this stuff.
Right.
As a kind of opportunity to reflect on who God is. I think it would be valuable for us to ask ourselves, what are we implying about God? You know, maybe this one's not a real danger, but I think of Santa Claus. He knows when you've been, you know, naughty or nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a portrayal of the God figure, the authority figure? Do we want to nuance that? So I suppose I don't have a direct answer to your question. I think it's a great one to reflect on, but I don't see it as a problem to have our own telling of the story. Again, there are 4 gospels, and there were some others too. We can have our own telling of the story, but we should think about the fact that story is theology. Story does communicate our ideals. Story does communicate big ideas. I guess I'm just repeating myself, but that's worth contemplating. What are the big ideas that we're communicating through the way that we're telling the story?
Even through complete fiction.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Right.
The Grinch. It's a great story, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. There's so many great narratives this time of year that communicate Christian themes, but through obviously untrue stories. But anyway, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I don't know. Did you have something more you wanted to say to that?
No. I liked how you responded to that, and yeah. I'm doubling down.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bjorn. It just reminds me how pervasive and important the nativity story is to our culture in America. I know we look forward to all the celebrations and, you know, the church services and the children's choir and all that. We had our Christmas tree up before Thanksgiving. So it's just what we do, and we look forward to it and enjoy it. David Klober, please go right ahead.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Oh, good. Good morning to everybody. I liked our first question that came up as part of the conversation about the development of a theme or an idea throughout the different narratives in the order they were written. And it seems to me there's another trend that you see through those narratives in the order they were written. And that's a focus on either the external or the internal impact of Jesus coming. When you take a look at Mark, everything is the exterior shot. It's the actions that you see happening. It's the news story of the guy on the street who saw the bank robbery, and here are the facts as they're laid out. Then you get to Matthew, and he starts trying to pin it to a deeper meaning, this royalty, this authority for God to act in this way, or this man Jesus to act in a certain way. Then you get to Luke, and it's even more interior. It's this God who cares so deeply that he's involving all these outcast people, these people. He's touching the leper in Luke. He's doing things that are so personally involved. And then you get to John. And John now has had enough time to ruminate over the importance of these things. And he's come to the realization that a God who merely comes externally doesn't complete the story. It's the God who comes internally. And so we get the idea that he didn't just come to indwell Mary, he came to indwell all of us. And so we see this complete transformation from just a simple exterior screenshot of things that happened to the deeper meanings, the personal involvement, and then this complete, we are to become part of this kingdom through Christ dwelling in us. So I think there's a real development of the story there.
I think that's a fascinating line of thought. I like it. Thank you.
There's one other. I'm going to close my door here real quickly. Hold on.
Go ahead.
I have a little yappy dog barking. You mentioned the signs that John talks about, these evidentiary proofs that Jesus was who he said he was. Mm-hmm. And they also speak to this interior validation of the story. And I'll just give you a couple. Number one, John mentions these 8 miracles, these 8 proofs, but he also mentions these great I am statements. And there's 8 of those. And you sit down on a Sabbath afternoon, you start matching up these I ams with the miracles. And you see him saying, I am the way. To them, that was, I'm the road, I'm the path. Well, why could Jesus walk on water? He was the road. He was the path. He could, that's it. Why could he raise Lazarus? I am the resurrection and the life. And you get to the very first proof you mentioned, the water to wine. And that ties to his very last I am statement. I am the vine. And what does the vine do? It takes water and turns it into wine. And so that very statement again speaks to that interior connection that is the entire thrust of the birth of Jesus, is that he wants that connection internally with us so God's life can run through us. So again, I see kind of a flow and development. We'd be lost without Mark. That was the starting point, but I'm sure glad we have John.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah. And I love that kind of chiastic matching structure too. I'm glad you brought that out. But, and there's a lot too, also, I'm going to springboard off of your comment, but I appreciate it very much. I think there's a lot to John in terms of understanding what it means, what recreation means. That Jesus came into the broken creation, and he's still the creator, and he's recreating. In each of those stories, you see a different sort of thing occurring. Of course, the culmination is resurrection from the dead, but the beginning is he restored joy and honor to a wedding feast. I mean, this is part of the recreation. This is part of the restoration, is to restore joy, to remove the embarrassment. Wow. I mean, so if we could think in terms of this is God incarnate, working restoratively within the human family, and we go through each of those signs of proving that, or offered as evidence of this claim, it could also provide us quite a bit of guidance in how we relate to other humans in a restorative way.
All right. Thank you. Gina Jett is up. Go right ahead, my dear.
First off, I'm just going to say I raised my hand when there weren't any others raised because I'm having compassion on the moderator, my husband, and there's nothing worse than having an hour and a half left to fill with no hand raised.
I've got no problem just cutting it off if there's nobody speaking.
I'm encouraging people to raise your hands. But I just focused on the message from Luke where the angel appears and says, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news. It will cause great joy for all the people." And I just wanted to focus on those different phrases and compare and contrast it to the theology that I was raised with and the theology that's put forth by the church. We've heard in this seminar that many Adventists at the time they are ready to die are very much in fear and have very much spent their lives in fear of the second coming of God. And I just want to embrace the statement of the angel that says, "Do not be afraid," and wonder what we're doing to promote that message as opposed to a message of fear. And then I wanted to focus on this thing that says, "I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people." And we've been talking the last few weeks about individual churches and whether they are joyful places. And I think that is something we should discuss. And then the phrase for all the people, do we have a message that's available to all the people? And when you look at the 28 fundamental beliefs and the different policies of the church and practices of excluding different kinds of people, does the church see itself as self-appointed by God or Jesus or somebody else, the General Conference, or just these are the kinds of people the Adventist church attracts, to try to divide up the church to where it's these kinds of people and those kinds of people, and these people we're comfortable with and these we're not, so we're going to exclude them? And I'm wondering if at some point we have a theology that's been conflated with Santa Claus. And I wonder if the message about the investigative judgment and the book where God's writing down the people's sins and you know, who makes it and who doesn't make it, if that's comparable to the naughty and nice list, and we kind of generate our theology as a Santa Claus theology instead of good news that will cause great joy in all the people.
I like it. I'm inclined to talk, but there might be wisdom in just leaving your comment on its own. It's focusing in on that. Well, I'm going to talk anyway. So we've talked about the development in these Gospels, the development of understanding of who Jesus was and what it all means. But I wonder if there's something also in the composite or the kind of mosaic where the Matthew can speak to the tendency to want to make it about a kingdom. And the kingdom is about power structure and about the next question, as soon as you establish a hierarchy, is where am I in that hierarchy? And where are you, right? And Jesus pushed against that. There was this whole upside down kingdom in that theme in Matthew, where, everyone matters. Everyone is of value. Those who think they matter more than others actually don't. And so I think that Matthew could push back against that exclusionary approach in a different way than Luke does, where he does it right on the nose. These people matter that others thought didn't matter, because Jesus validates them in the way that he comes. And of course, John can give us some insight into what it means to be restorative, to be recreative, because we see these snapshots, these glimpses of the way that Jesus did it. He restores joy to a wedding. He gives a man back his eyes when others had just turned him into a theological debate, right? That's quite a contrast. We turn people's lives into theological debates, and Jesus says, no, we're going to create something good here instead. So I wonder, along the same line, if each of these Gospels contributes a piece to that mosaic of who God is and what it means to be a godly person in our world now. But thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. That struck me as more than just a little time fill. So well done. Back to the pulpit. Linda, please go ahead.
Well, Gina, I, like you, was trying to help Dan out. So thought I would raise my hand. And compared to Gina's very deep and lovely thoughts, my question will probably seem like a hand grenade. And Dr. Wibberding, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm going to ask my question. You might be tempted to think I'm asking for your opinion, but I'm not specifically. But the thought or the question really comes to mind, and I wonder if you might be able to comment on what you believe to be the state of thinking of Adventist theologians about the nature of Christ when he was born. I presume there are those that believe that Jesus was born with a human nature, that would be similar to that of Adam before he ate from the tree of life. I wonder if there are also those who believe, conversely, that Jesus' human nature would conform to Adam's after he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So where is, and I might have a follow-up question, but where is your belief about, what do you believe about where the thinking is among Adventist scholars today about that?
Yeah, so within theological scholarship, we have subsets. We have the systematic theologians. And I think our systematic theologians concern themselves with that question, probably most. we have biblical theologians, and I don't think that's much of the conversation. So I'm not sure I could give an assessment as to where people are, just because it's not talked about as much in that sphere. We don't need to settle those questions the same way. And practical theologians, I think we don't touch it very much either. So I don't think it's a center of conversation except in among systematic theologians. And my sense is that there's a bit of a split, usually not a hostile split, but some will emphasize the human nature of Christ post-fall, and others will emphasize the human nature of Christ pre-fall, usually because of the direction that the answer takes us next, the implications. And then there is, I think, the center of gravity among Adventist theologians right now seems to be, maybe it's somehow both. That's what I hear most often when I'm talking, when I'm dialoguing with others about it. But it's not as hot of a topic as it maybe used to be.
Well, first of all, for those of us that might not be fully conversant, can you explain the difference between a systematic theologian versus a biblical theologian versus a practical theologian?
Yeah, okay. So a systematic theologian, that's the kind of, I guess, how we interact with systematic theology is probably in our doctrinal study guides and our doctrinal statements. So this is a rational presentation of all of the data to try to reach a position and defend that position with the data. Whereas a biblical theologian may look at the Gospel of Mark and say, okay, here's what we think Mark is saying. Who cares what the others are saying right now? We're talking about Mark, right? Practical theology is more concerned about where the rubber meets the road. How is this affecting human lives? And for the most part, the answer to that question could have implications, but it's not the center of where most people live. Yeah.
But then when you say some may think it's both, can you shed some light on that? I'm having a hard time forming a mental picture of that.
Yeah. So when we talk about the nature of Christ, we can see. Now, let me back up. Are you having trouble forming a mental picture of the implications of that, or the specifics of how we would get to that conclusion?
All the above.
Oh, okay. All right. So clearly, well, I shouldn't say clearly. The general sense is that Jesus in the Gospels, as we see his story unfold, he's not noted to have sinned anywhere, right? He's sinless. He doesn't commit sins. Adam and every other human after the fall did. So there's something, the argument would be there's something different going on here. He has some sort of an edge. At the same time, we see him suffering. He's not like Adam before the fall, where everything physically was fine. He's suffering emotional distress. He's suffering physical distress. He's having the experience of the fallen, even though he's living the character of the unfallen. So I think that's where we would kind of go to that middle ground, and some of that might just be trying to keep the peace, but.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate your comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've actually contributed to the conversation for you, but.
Was that the follow-up you warned us about, Linda, or have you got anything else?
Well, out in the hinterlands, we hear about this, and we hear that it's a hotly contested topic, and I feel somewhat comforted by the fact that it just doesn't seem to be, based on our Dr. Wibberding's observations, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like whenever we're defining the nature of Christ, we have to understand that there's a history of Christianity trying to do this and doing it badly without agreeing. When we talk about the Trinity, that one also resurges as an all-important issue. But we've struggled with how to define God forever. And maybe the problem is that we can't fully define God, and we should probably stop trying at some point.
Well, and I suppose there's a sense in which it flies against the whole idea. You spoke about this in eloquent terms, but we all apparently belong, most of us belong to a denomination that wishes to be very precise about honing in on specific doctrinal clarity, and perhaps being willing to tolerate a bit of ambiguity is a better path.
I think so.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks, Linda. Professor, you talked about practical theology. Is that what is meant with under your title of Professor of Applied Theology and Biblical Studies?
Yeah, well, honestly, I've been thinking I need to ask if they can change my title, because applied theology tends to be do as you're told. Here's what the theologians have discovered, and so you apply that. Whereas practical theology is more of a cycle where we try to apply what our theological study has discerned, has come up with, and as we apply it in human lives, we discover that there are inadequacies, and so we propose new ways of seeing things, and that comes back to the biblical theologians, biblical studies experts, systematic theologians, and then we have some dialogue, and we may shift our position a bit, and then we go back to applying it to human lives, and we find more inadequacies. And so the practical theology is more of a cycle of discovery, whereas applied theology is one direction. Do as you're told.
Very good. Thank you. All right, Doug and or Teresa Myers, go right ahead.
Thank you. And I don't mean any disrespect, but I may turn off my video. I just am post-op from a surgery and have to move around to keep comfortable, so I may disappear from the video, but I'm still very much on the audio.
Yes, go ahead.
Over the last few months, and maybe the last few weeks in particular, thinking about the Advent in ways that Adventists usually don't, I came across something that helped me immensely with the Gospels. So near the end of Jesus' ministry, he tells the apostles to go. And I think, although I'm no historian, that's for sure, I think that's what they do, as I understand. They go. And so they go to different parts for the most part, as I understand it. And they're creating these little enclaves of people that are listening to them and absorbing what they're saying and thinking about it and becoming little congregations, I guess. Just down the road is a Catholic Church of St. Mark's. And that prompted me to think about something that as an Adventist I have almost never thought about, is that early Christianity perhaps was more like the Catholic churches, not church, but churches, in that there's the St. Mark's Church, and there's the St. Matthew's Church, and St. John's Church, and St. Mary's Church, and everybody else. And they're each very much focused on what they know and developing what they know, and the story is then elaborated on and used. And that really helped me understand the differences between the Gospels in a way that I'd never really thought about before. And it brought me to another point that I thought was very helpful and very much relates to ATSS. All four of the Gospels talk about the ministry of not John the Apostle, but John the Baptist. And you talked about that in such a marvelous way, as well as the idea of reaching out to the marginalized. And it talks about John the Baptist in one specific way through all four Gospels. It talks about the wilderness. And I thought, this is so interesting, because John grew up as an insider. His dad was a priest, so he was a PK.
Mm-hmm.
And logically, he would have probably continued in that, but for maybe his parents were so old that they passed away before he really got a grasp on it. I don't know. That's one theory. But maybe he intentionally decided that he did not want to be a part of the insiders. He wanted to be on the margins and minister to those on the margins.
Interesting.
And that was so powerful to me that I thought, this exemplifies for me why I'm part of ATSS. What he said was repent, which means change, do things differently. And that's what I see ATSS is. That's the message of ATSS is repent, change, do things differently. Don't be the same. Don't be co-opted by Pax Romana. Don't be a part of the priesthood that is part of the co-opting. And as a result of that, then Jesus takes that and embodies that. And I just thought that is so helpful to me to cast my affection and my affinity for ATSS and for the presenters here and yours today particularly.
I really appreciate your observations. I think that's a profound line of thought. You started with the Catholic Church and the St. Mark's and St. Matthew's, and that I think that there's great value in fostering the variety. I also love your perspective on the potential of what John the Baptist might have been doing there. But to springboard off the variety thing, I think that's an underlying message of the fact that we have 4 Gospels. But I think we really need to let this settle in and recognize that we do this whether we want to or not. We kind of, when we have this organization, especially an organization that says we've got the truth or the best version of the truth out in the world, then we've all got to have the same way of thinking about it. We've never done that. From the very beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, we've never been of one mind on all matters.
Amen.
And it does tend to be, theology is the love child of culture and scripture. I mean, and probably some other things mixed into the gene pool. Our own past experience, our specific context, which of course is tied to culture. But you look at New England Adventism at the very beginning, it was very different than the Midwestern Adventism of Michigan. And the California Adventism, the next great center of Adventism was California, and it was very different still. You had, when we moved to the West and got to California, those Michigan Adventists were so deeply disturbed because Adventists out in the West were innovating in worship music. I mean, they were bringing rhythm into the music by this pump organ. Fast forward about 100 years, and it was the drums bringing rhythm, but it was innovation in music. The California Adventists were wearing jewelry. You see a lot of pictures of early Adventist pioneer women wearing earrings in California. And you also had things like the going to dances. The Napa Valley Adventists were, not just living next to the vineyards. They were also drinking alcohol. And those Michigan Adventists were disturbed by this. So that's like 100+ years ago. And these are kind of the same issues we see, flashpoints, some of the same flashpoints we see now. But I think it illustrates the fact that there's always an incarnation of our faith in our current context, in who we are, in our past experience. And we need to acknowledge and validate that rather than making it points of conflict.
Amen.
We could take 1 Corinthians 12 and the body of Christ and apply it broadly to our Adventist world and take Paul's implied message, I suppose it's actually a pretty explicit message, to value the differences instead of seeing them as threats. These are gifts, not threats. So that was my springboard.
Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Doug. That your comments make me think that we do have time, and we're not going to belabor it. But if those of you want to take the time with this seminar to express your thoughts about this international meeting of the minds and ability to express your ideas about the church and where it's come from and what this ministry, we'll call it a ministry, is doing, it's a great time to do it. George has been waiting patiently. Please, George, go right ahead.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for this presentation, Professor. It was very helpful. And sorry, my voice is a little bit bad today. And I really learned something good today, as usually on ATSS, was when you talked about the four Gospels, 4 books, and a progression was established from your talk and the discussion afterwards. And I never thought about that progression from one book to another and getting richer. And so while I was thinking, I thought that something should be added to that progression. And Jesus' ministry didn't stop at his ascension. And then I want to jump to another book in the New Testament that should be added to this conversation, because there is where we have the assurance of his positive ministry in heaven on our behalf after his ministry here on earth. And I'm talking about the book of Hebrews, of course, on verse 1. In the past, God talked to us, revealed himself to the prophets, but in the last days, through Jesus Christ, period. Although Adventists have been using this verse a little bit different. In the last days, through his spirit, or the spirit of prophecy. But those are not originals. And I want to call the attention to that book because I am a big fan of Hebrews. I read it, I don't know, hundreds of times literally. And let me share quickly why. Because I studied in Brazil, where I lived after we immigrated, my parents from Europe. For 39 years, I lived in Brazil. And my education was from the school in São Paulo. I studied 16 years in the same school, from first grade to finishing theology in college. And I remember one day, there was a professor there, an American missionary, Jerome Justison, if anyone knows him, was a brilliant teacher, very friendly and very knowledgeable. And one day I asked him a question on the street. I was very close to him emotionally. And I was talking to him and said, by the way, I asked him something. And he said, George, you need to read the book of Hebrews. Read it and read it. Don't stop reading. I was busy with so many other books and classes. I didn't. It was only, and I graduated in 1972. Only 1980, when I got Desmond Ford's Glacier Review document in a book format and started studying that, I said, oh my gosh, how did I miss that? My teacher told me to read it and read it and read it, and I didn't. So since 1980, I have been reading this book very often. And we need to link the 4 Gospels to this book, because that's where we have the consummation, the assurance that Christ ascended, and right away he got there to his position. It's very sad that the Adventist Church doesn't believe in or doesn't follow, or doesn't believe in, I don't know what the deal is, in the book of Hebrews, that they take Ellen White's position, which is opposite to it, and they just follow that. And I can understand that. I can't understand that. So my point is just that, as a comment, let's put the book of Hebrews along with the 4 Gospels, because there we have more revelation about everything else. If I were persecuted and were allowed to keep only one book from the Bible, that'd be Hebrews, just Hebrews. So I'm here in just advocating for the book of Hebrews to be taken more seriously and in the conversations and studies. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I think that's a fair point. So in the progression of understanding, you have you start with Mark, the basic reporting of the facts, and then you progress all the way to Hebrews, which makes all of those connections with the Old Testament system, and that makes a lot of sense. At first, I thought you were going to go to Revelation. Revelation 12 has the Christmas story too, and there's a dragon in it, but I think we can put that in our pageants. Anyway, I appreciate the comment.
Thank you, George. That kind of reminds me to highlight or thank Professor Wibberding about the larger value of his presentation, not just the incarnation story, but that why do we need 4 gospels? Because there's 4 different points of view, at least, that are all valuable in their own right. So Ray and or Bobby, I think Ray usually is the speaker. Go right ahead.
It's me this time.
Oh, yay.
I really, really appreciated your presentation, Dr. Wibberding. I had never connected everything the way you did for me. And that's probably because I'm not a great studier and I'm pretty simple, I guess. I was raised on Arthur Maxwell's Bible stories. And, you know, everything in there pretty much follows our basic beliefs, the SDA basic beliefs. And as I was reading through the Bible as prescribed by Pathfinders or something, and I got to John and I read John 1:1, a light bulb just went off in my mind. I did not realize that the God of the Old Testament was in fact Jesus. And that just brought me to my knees. Every time I read that verse, I just get the chills. Because the God of the Old Testament, who gave the 10 Commandments, who created, who made our world and everything, was in fact Jesus. And everybody's conversation, everybody's comments and everything on this subject has meant a lot to me, has made me think of things in a different way than I had before. I really don't have a question, but that is my comment. And thank you for your presentation.
I appreciate that reflection back and just the profound value of connecting John 1 with Genesis 1 and how that changes the way we see the God of the Old Testament. Profound. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Your comments will always be welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Let me go to Martin. I want to make sure he's unmuted there. Go ahead, Martin, if you can unmute.
There we are. Yeah. Hey, the Gospel Commission, I think there's a subtle but extremely significant error that affects our missional strategy. We see it in terms of an imperative. We see paintings of Jesus pointing his finger, go, you know, as if, we're supposed to change our geography, but actually it's not an imperative. Passive participle literally means as you're going about your life. Be a teacher to the people, become incarnate with the environment where you are. And this is from the Catholic Douay Rheims Bible. They've got it right here. Going, therefore. Teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father. In other words, become a part of where you are. Get involved in the pain of the people, and rather than feeling that we have to, oh, I better, go somewhere that, just where you are, open up your heart, open up your eyes, and be the fragrance of Christ where you are.
Wow. Yeah, I think that could, if we took that, I'm trying to wrestle with the implications of what you just said. But it seems like that would significantly shift our behavior, and maybe we would focus less on getting the job done and counting up the results, and more on, hey, how did Jesus live restoratively in the space he was in, and how can we follow his example?
And I think this syncs with the Matthew 25, when Jesus comes again with his rewards. I was in prison. You visited me. You're right there. I was there, and you did this. I was hungry, and you didn't walk past. You fed me. Like the Good Samaritan, he was just going on his way. He saw somebody that was in trouble and helped them. So that's where I believe Jesus wants us to be.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Very good. I'm pleased to welcome Laura Wibberding to the seminar. We know her from several wonderful presentations. Go right ahead.
I know her too.
No,
Yes.
Lucky you.
I'm in the next room over from him. Yes. So been sitting here contemplating, what do I want to make Jim talk about when I ask my question? And I think I want to go back to the beginning. And one of the most profound ideas for me is that there's so much of the human factor shaping these four accounts that if we only had one gospel, we would think that this was just, we probably wouldn't see how much each of the gospel writers had shaped their accounts based on their own priorities and their own concerns and things. But because we can compare them, we can see that. And it's a very unfundamentalist thing to see how much human influence is in Scripture, and that's a topic unto itself. But you started with the idea that because we see the differences here and in these four accounts, we see the different writers shaping the Christmas story according to their needs, and that gives us freedom to interpret it and apply it according to our needs. What message would you pull out of the Nativity for today? In what things do you see significant to our setting, and what would be your homiletical idea from it, preaching it today?
Oh, no, I didn't prepare a sermon, Laura. You knew that. No, yeah, and I thank you for that. I think she often helps to focus my thoughts. So for me, I think the central idea of the Incarnation is that God met people where they were. That's not new, of course, but God met people where they were to be restorative. Each of the gospel writers has a different sort of restorative purpose, but each has a restorative purpose. You go to Matthew, and Matthew is about that kingdom that everybody, or that many people hoped for, and they had visions of what that was like. And Matthew says, this is the Messiah, the promised king for that kingdom. And look what he did with that. Look what he taught. You've got the Sermon on the Mount there, talking about how to be a good citizen, how to relate to other human beings in different ways. Like, okay, so when are we going to appoint the cabinet? It's not about that. It's about how you live as a citizen of this human family, of this kingdom of God that's of heaven and not of earth. So it's living in the space that you are restoratively, I think is the big idea. And so you look at Luke, and his concern is those who have been marginalized. And he says, hey, look what the Jesus story did in their lives. Okay, so I should live restoratively in reference to the people that I see marginalized for whatever reason. And we have the standard categories of those being marginalized, but we also have a lot of other ways in which we push people aside and we minimize their value, even in terms of our leadership structure, how we function as leaders and all of these things. So how can I be lifting people up and not pushing them down? Okay. And then John, you have this whole recreation vision, which is just like the big picture of restorative. And you have those individual cases of how Jesus interacted with them. And the one that really grips my heart to maybe focus it a little bit more, Laura, is John 9, where they made this man's life a theological debate. That's what they had done. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? It wasn't a question of whether somebody was to blame and whether God was punishing him for it. It was just simply, academically speaking, was it him or was it his parents? And Jesus, he bypasses the whole thing to restore. I wish we could get from the Incarnation, I wish we could get to the place where that's how we lived, where we didn't turn people's lives into debates. Instead, we just found ways to restore. So.
Okay. We had a couple hands that I think have dropped off. If anyone would like to speak and didn't get a chance yet, now's the time to raise a hand. Bjorn, I know you said you might have to leave. Is that correct? Or do you have any final thoughts for us?
No, I don't actually have to leave. I think it was Lauren that had to leave. But I think Richard's had his. Richard, have you spoken yet? Or it looks like
no, I have not.
Oh, okay.
Richard
I'm sorry.
Okay.
There you are. Go right ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Dan, before I start, I just have to tell you, every time I see your background, I'm just intrigued with your trumpet collection.
It is a collection. I do play, that's true, but I've collected a number of horns, and if I try to raise the camera, it's going to pull the cord out of my machine. But I have 6 up on the wall and some others. My older son decided I needed to make that hobby an art display in my office area here. So,
well, I'm a brass junkie, and my playing experience is at the other end of the sonic spectrum. But I would collect tubas, but I can't afford it. Hey, Pastor Wibberding, I am going to call you Pastor because to me, the presentation has been truly pastoral. And you've opened a window and let in a breath of fresh air in my mind with your contrasting of the various perspectives of the Gospels and the various positions that they took. And I was especially intrigued by the juxtaposition of Matthew's and Luke's emphasis. To me, it strikes me this way. Luke really emphasizes the shepherds, who were pretty much at the bottom of the social structure of the time of Christ. And Matthew emphasizes the kingdom aspect. And I see that as, there were 2 visitors to Christ in Bethlehem. There were the shepherds, and then there were what we loosely call the wise men, who also appear in all the pageants that were, subjected to this time of year. And what that, I guess, means to me is that Jesus came for everybody, the full spectrum, because he's got both the low and the very high, the intellectuals, the royal segment, and the shepherds. But the fact, I think, that it starts with the shepherds gives me a lot of hope, because I don't know, I kind of feel an affinity in some ways to the shepherds, their occupation, and the fact that the angels made their first announcement, the billboard, the great show, to the shepherds, to this old sinner, just really, really strikes home. And I thank you for bringing that out.
Yeah, but I love your point. I thank you for that. That this is the whole spectrum, whole span, both the king and the shepherd.
I agree with you, Richard. Thanks very much. One of the very few sermons I presented focused on the nativity story, and specifically on the shepherds and the angels as the 2 main players. And I found that very valuable and important. Ed, I'm glad you're available. Go right ahead. I'm asking, yeah, go ahead, Ed. Oh, I need you to unmute. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
I'm sorry if it's noisy. I'm driving. I had the unfortunate experience of teaching Revelation 8 through 14 in 1 hour.
Must be exhausted.
Yeah, well, frustrating at least. I want to ask a question. I did not hear the presentation, but I know it involved 4 Gospels and the Incarnation. And the 4 Gospels are not consistent. Some emphasize one thing, some emphasize another. Some tell a story one way, some tell it another way. Sometimes they contradict each other. And it says to me that in the writing of the Gospels, there's a fair amount of humanity involved. And so I want to ask you, Jim, what you think the implications are for our view of inspiration. Also, I want to ask you what you think about the notion that Alden Thompson raised in his book Inspiration, that he views the work of prophets writing as an incarnation, also a form of incarnation, where the human and the divine come together to produce something. So I'm just throwing those out as questions to get your viewpoints on those. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first part was the variety of the tellings of the stories, how they speak to our understanding of inspiration. And then the other one was Alden Thompson's perspective on the combination of human and divine. Was that, did I frame that?
Yes, that the writing of Scripture was sort of an act of incarnation in that it involved both human and divine, just like Jesus did.
Yeah. I think, you know, I try not to, at least when I'm conscious of it, I try not to draw hard lines where we have inadequate information. We're not really told at length how inspiration worked with reference to Scripture. Really, I guess we just don't have a lot of information. So we're trying to make sense of the facts as we see them. So I would, first of all, say, I think we need to give each other some space to have differing views on how inspiration works precisely. And it may even work differently case by case. You know, it seems like inspiration was different for Moses when he received the 10 Commandments written in stone versus some of his other moments of discernment where he thought he understood God's will. And so perhaps there's a variety there. But I do think that there is plenty of evidence that there is the human involved in the task of writing the gospel stories or any book of the Bible. There's just too much evidence of that. And even if there wasn't originally, and I believe there was, there's plenty of evidence in the manuscripts we have that there was human variation. We have variants in manuscripts and so on. So I don't think a rigid view of inspiration is at all tenable for us, not helpful for us. But that bigger idea of the writing of the stories themselves being an act of incarnation, I deeply resonate with that idea, and I appreciate you suggesting it. An observation I made earlier, and I'm not sure if you were on, was that our Adventist faith itself has a different incarnation in each of its contexts. And it's not that it's, you know, exact all one way in one place and all another way in another place, but there's a center of gravity that's different in Michigan versus California versus Brazil versus Germany, southern Germany, you know, northern Germany. You just have regional differences. Our faith is always incarnate. It is a combination of revelation and culture and our experience and our personality. It just is. We can say that that's not objective enough. It doesn't fit our post-Enlightenment categories of proofs and evidentiary lines, and we have to be able to prove the one way it is. We can make those claims if we want to, but it doesn't work that way and never has. So we might as well live in reality. So faith is incarnate. It just is. And yes, I think that each of the gospel accounts are different because they are incarnate in the personality of the writer, in the perceptions of the writer, in the specific concerns with which they begin their literary endeavor. So I think basically I'm at length saying I agree with you, Ed. Thanks.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I had Gene up for but I don't see the window. Gene, can you hear me? Are you still up for a participation? If not, I'm going to go and we can come back to her if she's still available, to Gina Jett.
Hi, I just wanted to make another comment about the earlier presenter who talked about Jesus's command to go being going and doing it amidst yourself. And there's a prayer that's very powerful that I've heard prayed in our church many times is, God, forgive me for the things that I've done and for the things that I've left undone. And I think the very powerful part of that prayer is for the things I've left undone. And I think that the Adventist church, in my opinion, and you may disagree, tends to be very focused on the things people do. And, your behavior and being very focused on that and not so interested in what we've left undone. But I think we could really shift the prism on how we think about this, about thinking about Jesus' command of going and doing these things while you're in your travels, as opposed to going and witnessing as a different kind of theology. And I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I like that. As it regards the things left undone, I think Luke speaks quite a bit to that in the focus on the marginalized, the people that have maybe not actively been hurt or actively been pushed aside by everyone involved, but by maintaining the structures of marginalization. Everyone's participated in that.
Right.
I think Luke may speak to that directly.
I thought that was a very interesting point that I've never heard before about the past participle of go. So just thought I'd bring that up.
Gene, before you step aside, in the chat, I asked you if you'd be willing to do the closing blessing, which we do about this time, although we're perfectly willing to continue with some more commentary afterwards if people are interested.
Sure. Would you bow your heads with me? God in heaven, we thank you for an opportunity to get together with a group of believers who are willing to stretch their thinking and learn from each other. We are people from all over the world that hope we have open hearts and open minds and open our doors to the marginalized, for the people that you came to save. And we're asking your blessing on us this season in particular, and that we will take the spirit of open hearts with us throughout the next year. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. George, I think you're back. Let's see. Let me ask you to unmute if you can follow up now.
Yes, thank you. I noticed a few comments, Doctor, from you on the diversity of theologies. You just said it's a content Brazil, the East Coast, West Coast. I was raised in Brazil, so I was raised in that environment. And but in '89, I moved to California, to Riverside. So La Sierra Loma Linda is actually where my personality fit the best. I live in Reno now. I'm a retired psychologist, but live in Reno for 8 months. But La Sierra Loma Linda, it's where I could breathe the theology there, you see. I don't know if you would feel comfortable to speak on that. Well, but I will ask anyways, what is your opinion in terms of future? How tolerant, or how will the church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, manage the problem of tolerance of diverse cultures, personalities, and theologies? Because as of now, in the past, 13 years or so, the church has been actually radicalized by the GC. Ted Wilson radicalized the church in a manner that is unbelievable, in my opinion. But do you think that this will actually will make progress, or do you think that the church will stay blocked in this intolerance of and thinking that the unity is the same thing like uniformity? What is your opinion, if you feel comfortable saying anything about this, because I understand your position as a professor in a school? Thank you.
Yeah. And there are several ways that I can respond to that. So as far as the predicting the future, I'm probably not very good at that. But I think it has a lot to do with where the broader culture goes. The more I study our Adventist movement, there are certainly ways in which I see that there are certainly ways in which we are distinct from the streams of the culture, but there are probably more ways in which we follow those streams. So is worldwide, or in our specific, country context, is culture moving more towards tolerance and pluralism? And if so, then I think the church will. Now, as it regards our General Conference leaders' choices, I think really their choice, whether they understand it or not, is whether they're going to allow for variety or they're going to split the church. I'm pretty sure that in North America, we will have a structural separation of some kind if the hard lines keep coming. I see the frustration building. Some of the loyalty to the organizational structure is generationally bound. Not all of it, of course, and no generation is homogenous, but I think that we're less and less concerned about being connected to the world church as time goes on here in North America. And so if world church leaders misbehave in the perception of a lot of the population, there will be a structural split of some kind, I think. So I think we're going to get variety one way or the other. There are easier ways to do it, and there are more painful ways to do it. As it regards unity versus uniformity, I do think that's a central theological issue there. Biblical unity is really encapsulated in places like 1 Corinthians 12, where the push was appreciate the differences, see the differences as gifts and not threats. Or Acts 15, where there was a push to make everybody, the same, everybody be circumcised. And what they came up with was, we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. Here's a short list of things that bind us together. So biblically, I think unity is achieved through valuing the diversity, not by not by eliminating the diversity. And if we can wrestle with that theological concept and come to what I believe is a more biblical view of unity through diversity and not opposed to diversity, then we'll be in a much better place. So I'm not sure if that was part of your question, but you mentioned that, and I do have perspective on that.
Thank you, George. We've run out of hands, which is okay. I do so appreciate this seminar and this gathering. I was not raised as an Adventist. I married into it, and my wife wasn't a practicing Adventist at the time, but we wanted to raise our children in a Christian church. So we went to the local church, which was the Palo Alto church, with Lauren Seibold as the pastor there. a younger Loren than he is now, although I think of him in the same way as then. And I doubt very seriously if I would have continued attending and eventually joining the church if there was anyone other than him or someone very like him at the pulpit. And actually, he left for Ohio before I actually professed faith and joined the church, but it was his doing that was responsible for it. And he was surprised when I told him I had actually joined the church. He didn't think it would work that way. I have to say I've since kind of removed myself from the Adventist church, but I, like many of you, enjoy attending this seminar and expressing your views openly, sometimes frustrations, but increasingly some hope for the future and the possibility that you can maintain your relationships with the people and your background in a positive way. So I want to thank him. I don't think he's with us currently online, but express my gratitude to Loren and what he's done. I think it surprised him that this seminar and the magazine he's worked with have had such a far reach and have been so important to so many people. So that's my thank you, and certainly Bjorn and the crew, which do the fundraising for this to help support the message and carry things to a nicer place for the coming year and beyond, I think are to be supported. So thank you, Professor Wibberding. It was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed analyzing the different gospels, and as I said at the start, we've been working our way through Luke and noting differences in the four gospel writers, and this was an educated presentation on some of the differences and the different approaches, and I'm going to take that with me when I do our next get together. So I wish all of you a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, wonderful holidays. Anything more from you, James?
I'll just thank you for the conversation. Love the interchange today. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to sign off. I don't know if that closes the whole door, but have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.